Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. And today we're going to talk a little bit about what other museum battleships have done for dry docking or in lieu of dry docking. I think there's some interesting stories to tell there because as we've been planning for our dry docking process, we have absolutely reached out to the other museum battleships to see what they've done or haven't done and why they've made the decisions they have. And that has very much informed the decisions we've made. So, the first of the 8 American museum battleships, of course, is Texas. And Texas has had some of the most famous and public dry dockings of any museum ship. I'm going to come back to them briefly in a minute. But you guys are certainly aware that Texas is in dry dock right now. So they've got some really recent experience to share with us. And even more importantly, being about 20 years older than an Iowa-class battleship and having been operated as a museum ship longer, they are absolutely one of the top ships that we here on New Jersey watch with an eye towards the future. If Texas is seeing this problem now, well then in 20 years, we're likely going to see the same problem. So what are they doing? Again, I'll come back to them in a second, because the next two are kind of interesting as well. North Carolina and Alabama were 2 of the next American battleships to be turned into museum ships. Being on the southern and Gulf coasts of the United States, they're subject to annual hurricanes. And there was a major concern that these ships, not being manned by Navy crews, could be swept out to sea by these powerful storms. So, this first generation of American museum ships, one of the common things that they do, especially for the ones down south, like Texas, North Carolina, Alabama, Yorktown, the first thing they do is they sink them down into the mud, intentionally grounding them so that they cannot be swept out to sea. This is certainly not the ideal. Being far up a river here in New Jersey, further north, we would not do that except as a last resort, because right now, the ship does what she's designed to do. She rises and sets down with the tide, whereas, say, a ship that's sitting in the mud, the tide rises and falls along the side of the ship. The stuff that's permanently underwater or under mud stays relatively preserved. It's in a relatively anaerobic, oxygen-free environment, so it doesn't corrode. The stuff above the water stays in pretty good shape and is accessible. You can paint it where you are. The stuff that's constantly getting wet and dried as the tide comes up and down or waves are hitting it is the stuff that corrodes the fastest. That wind-water line is where you see the most corrosion on ships. So if your ship is floating, it has the smallest possible wind-water line. If you've got a 6-foot tidal flow, well now your wind-water line, instead of being a foot in each direction, is 6 feet in each direction. So it was an interesting idea for early museum ships, and a really easy workaround for hurricanes that could very badly damage those ships. And not just the ships, their local communities. If something happens to, say, North Carolina and she gets pulled out into, the Cape Fear River, she collides with other ships. She might block the shipping channel. She might hit a bridge. She could do serious, serious damage to the entire economy there. So it absolutely makes sense that they did that. Is not something that every museum ship should do. Those of us that do not see that sort of environmental challenge, it is better for our artifacts to leave it floating. Obviously, if these ships are aground, they have trouble dry docking. The first time Texas goes into dry dock, they had to refloat her, and that caused extra expenses for the projects. Alabama, North Carolina, they have no intentions of doing that, but both ships have done the next best thing. You could argue an even better thing. They built a coffer dam all the way around the ship so that it can be filled with water, look like the ship is floating normally, but if they ever need to do major hull maintenance work, all they've got to do is drain that coffer dam, and then they can do the work right there in situ. And North Carolina has absolutely done some work on this. Here's some great pictures of them replating her bow peak tanks. Remember I was talking about how the peak tanks are the thinnest plate on an American fast battleship. North Carolina is one of the ships that had issues with that in our talking to them, we figured out, hey, we've got to inspect these areas on us. So because of their cofferdam, they've been able to do all their work right there without having to go into dry dock. Their cofferdam cost approximately $18 million, which is roughly twice what we're going to spend going into dry dock. However, they don't have to pay to go into dry dock ever. Anytime they need hull work done, they just do it right there in place. So it's a higher initial expense, but then a lower lifetime expense. So that is absolutely something that we are watching as New Jersey gets older. As we start to approach Texas's age, we may well come to a point where keeping the ship floating full time is not the best way to preserve the ship. It may come to a point where we need yard periods more frequently than the 30 years that we're planning on right now. So by building a similar cofferdam around the ship right here on the Delaware River, that's absolutely something that we're watching how it's working on North Carolina so that we can plan for it here for some future period. This may well be the last time that we dry dock New Jersey in a traditional dry dock. On the extreme other end of the spectrum, New Jersey, Wisconsin, and Iowa have never been dry docked by museums. They were all dry docked as part of the decommissioning process, and as museums, we have not dry docked them yet. Part of this has to do with the availability of dry docks. There is a very limited number of dry docks that can take a ship this size. Most of them are operated by the Navy, and the Navy has trouble doing the work that they need to do on their own active ships. So there's very little availability for museum ships like us that are neither funded by the Navy nor operated by the Navy in any way to get into those sorts of dry docks. So fortunately, New Jersey was placed here in Philadelphia near the civilian-run dry docks at the former Philadelphia Navy Yard, which means that we've got relatively ready access to a dry dock that can handle us. It's one of the reasons why this Camden, Philadelphia area was a much better home location for Battleship New Jersey than some of the other ones that were proposed back in the late 90s and early 2000s. Wisconsin's in Norfolk. She's near a dry dock that can handle her, but it's always got Navy ships in it. So they're doing some really interesting work with underwater drones to clean the bottom of the ship and do that hull work in situ relatively periodically. Because the Navy is there in Norfolk, they have much more ready access to these companies that do that sort of work than, say, ships that are further away from Navy yards. So it's, they're doing some really interesting work to get as much time between dry dockings as possible while still getting really good surveys of the underwater hull and accomplishing underwater maintenance. Iowa is doing something similar. On the West Coast, there's considerably fewer dry docks than here on the East Coast, and so Iowa is doing some, I would call it hybrid work. They've got a cofferdam to do underwater hull work in situ, but it's not a full cofferdam around the ship. They can't do that in the port of Los Angeles. They take up a berth like that. But their cofferdam is movable. So we've talked about this in the past. We've showed you the one that Olympia uses right across the river from us. So you can essentially suction cup this onto the side of the ship and move around the hull, treating the wind-water line. Remember, that's your most critical area. So that brings you to the museum battleships that have actually been into a dry dock. The battleship Massachusetts went into dry dock for about 4 months between 1998 and 1999. They did this over winter, and they were able to get state funding to reactivate a dry dock that was able to handle her. And so they were able to go in and do a lot of work on their underwater hull during their off-season. Because we are in a relatively similar environment to them, being further north than most other battleships, we're trying to plan a similar type of yard period going in our slow winter season. Can you believe that poor Missouri doesn't get slow seasons like that? So we're looking at their project as a way to do ours over winter, and it was a similar scope of work. Next up is Missouri. She was the only Iowa-class battleship to ever get into dry dock, and possibly the only museum battleship to ever get into a Navy dry dock. I'm still not sure how they were able to convince the Navy Yard to let them into one of the dry docks at Pearl Harbor. But back in 2009, Missouri went into the dry dock for a project that cost about $18 million and ran a similar length of time in Massachusetts, about 4 months. And so we are very much working with Missouri as another Iowa-class battleship to figure out what scope of work we're going to be doing here. And then, of course, we have Texas, which interestingly is the only museum battleship to ever be dry docked twice as a museum. However, no museum battleship has ever been dry docked twice by the same organization. Texas has actually had 3 separate operators. The State Battleship Commission, I think is what they were originally called, operated the ship from the late 40s when she was open as a museum up into the 80s. And they were unable to ever dry dock the ship. Remember, they had her aground, so it was quite complicated. When they turned the ship over to the State Parks and Wildlife Service, one of the things that was identified early on as a project that needed to be accomplished was dry docking the ship. So the Parks and Wildlife Service had to refloat her, had to do a bunch of work, and so they got her into dry dock in, I want to say, 89, 90, and did a huge scope of work, relatively similar to what Texas is doing today. And they were trying to preserve as much original historic fabric as possible. So they were making patches, doubler plates, that sort of stuff, as opposed to cropping out huge parts of the ship. At that time, the ship was not corroded to the extent that she is today because she was 30 years younger. And so they were able to do that. However, they were not able to accomplish a second yard period, and it looked like not only was the exterior plating corroding, but they had some concerns about the framing, particularly at the stern of the ship that faced the shipping channel. That meant that they had to do a huge scope of work, again, to get her to the point that they could take her into dry dock. At the end of the day, the state turned the battleship over to the Battleship Texas Foundation, which is the organization that's currently doing the scope of work in dry dock today. And so as a battleship that is actively in the yard doing a major scope of work, we're absolutely talking with them. You've seen us, we've gone down there to see their ship in dry dock and talk to them about the scope of work that they're doing. Everything from the pre-dry docking period to see what work they were doing to get ready, what work they did during the tow, what sort of social media work they were doing to advertise the ship while they were there, and then to see what work they've done in the yard and what their dry dock tours are like. And so we've been down there 3 times already. We'll probably go down at least a 4th time as she is close to coming out of the yard or as she's coming out of the yard so we can see what the finished project looks like. I was specifically focusing on the 8 battleships today because they are the largest and closest in type to New Jersey. And so they're the ones that we look at first, but they're far from the only museum ships to be dry docked or not. And that's part of the interesting part of this story is some of these ships can't go into dry dock for various reasons, and it's interesting to see what they're doing in place of that. If you'd like to hear more about, say, the aircraft carriers or the cruisers or other ships that have been in dry dock that we've looked at as part of this project, let us know in the comment section down below. We might do that in a future Dry Docking Wednesday episode. Let us know if you have any other questions about this upcoming yard period, and we might get to those in a future episode as well. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. We really appreciate your support. It is allowing us to do a larger scope of work while we're in the yard. You can also support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find out about the museum and our channel. Thanks for watching.